Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Friday class, Parashat Tissa, and also Shabbat Para as well. The big question is, what really happened in the moment of fate? And I'm referring to the moment where post Het HaEgel, the dubious, egregious sin of the golden calf, where Moshe Rabbeinu, in a moment of absolute chaos, as he looks around and by witnesses, his nation falling apart at the seams, calls out, Mi ladonai elai, those famous words, who is to God, come to me. And of course, Vayasifu elav kol bnei Levi. At that moment, the tribe of Levi came and gathered to Moshe Rabbeinu. And we know at the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, in the Berachot of Zot HaBeracha, he identified that moment in talking about the tribe of Levi. And that's basically was his Beracha was based upon Ha'omer la'avihu u'lemo lo re'iti ve'etahav lo hikir ve'banav lo yada ki shamru ibmaltecha u'betecha yinsoru, who acted like he didn't know his family and relatives because he killed them basically in the name of God, kept the covenant and observed and was committed to your words. And because of that, said Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of his life in Zot HaBeracha, Yoru mishpatecha leYaakov v'toratecha leYisrael. He will, the tribe of Levi will, the Kohanim will be the teachers of Am Yisrael. They'll have the great virtuous honor and merit to serve Am Yisrael, to serve Hashem on behalf of Am Yisrael in the Bet HaMikdash, all because of that one moment. It behooves us to look at that moment and understand what the context was, what everybody else was doing, what indeed the Shevet Levi do. Essentially, they murdered a lot of people. What gave them the right to do that? And what that call of Mi LaHashem Elai really was. Because at that moment, history changed, absolutely. The original intent, as we know, was not for the tribe of Levi to serve. Levi was simply just the third child of Yaakov Avinu. There was no distinction that Levi had to earn them that right. Obviously, the elder was Reuven the Bechor, and we understand from Torah and from tradition that the Bechorot tribe, the elder tribe, was supposed to be those who represented and served Am Yisrael. Levi earned that distinction because of a moment in history, a moment of fate. So let's first try to get the context of what was happening. Moshe Rabbeinu came down. We'll not discuss the actual sin of Het HaEgel. Moshe Rabbeinu descended from that mountain. Prior to him descending, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu already told him what's going on. And we were told what the scene looked like prior to Hashem even informing Moshe Rabbeinu. But you could assume that after he was informed, he immediately prayed for Am Yisrael, seemingly preserved their existence, had that incredible exchange with Hashem, and then came down. You could assume that prior to breaking the Luchot, he saw the scene described prior to Hashem informing him of the dubious sin. And here is the scene. Of course, Aharon, which is another discussion for another day as well, what exactly was his role. But after Aharon built the Mizbeach and he called out, Hag LaHashem Machar, a holiday for God tomorrow, we assume that Aharon saw things were getting out of hand and his plan did not go as intended, and he was in a stalling tactic for Moshe Rabbeinu to come down. And it says as follows: Vayashkimu mimachorat v'ya'alu olot v'yagishu shalamim v'yesh ba'am le'echol v'shato v'yakumu l'sachek. From this pasuk, it's blatantly evident that there was not one mode of behavior. That Am Yisrael were not unified in their approach. Were they ever? No. But certainly not at the time of Chet HaEgel, were they unified in their approach. This pasuk, more than any other, indicates the different groupings and the different approaches of Am Yisrael to what occurred. Were most of the nation guilty of Chet HaEgel? Were they all idolatrous? Were most of them? Were some of them? What percentage? Who got what punishment? This pasuk says the next morning they got up and they offered sacrifices. Shalamim. Atnach, period in the pasuk. And then it says, Vayeshev ha'am. Whenever in different events across the narratives of the Torah and the desert, it says ha'am, it refers to a segment of the nation, a grouping, right? A portion, ha'am, and they sat to eat and drink. And then it says, and they got up, l'sahek. Well, we know from just modern simple Hebrew, l'sahek means to play around. That she says, based on Hakamim, that this implies some real difficult behavior, including, as she says, avodah zarah, gilui arayot, etc. That there was yet another approach, eating and drinking. Some people involved in very serious abonot, others bringing korbanot. The Ramban says this first approach of bringing korbanot, within that, there were a few groupings. There were those who were following the lead of Aharon and were bringing korbanot to Hashem. And then there was others that were bringing korbanot to the Egel, to the golden calf. And then besides that, some were this group Ha'am, another group were eating and drinking. That doesn't seem like a holy celebration. And then worse, others, by Yakumu l'sahek, were playing around in a very egregious and sinful manner. So that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was facing. He was facing different people, guilty, innocent, right? Now, it happens to be that when we'll fast forward, we know just from the deaths that certainly it was not a majority of the nation who were guilty of the serious avon, whatever the serious avon was, with the golden calf. The Rabbeinu, the Ri ibn Sha'ib, who's the student of the famous Rashba, actually theorizes that there was a fourth grouping of people. And I'll get to that in a moment. But besides the fact that Torah is here describing different groups, we also know that there were different levels of guilt because there were different forms of punishment. Well, one form of punishment is when Moshe Rabbeinu summoned Shevet Levi, and they said, "We're here for you." And he told them, "Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael," thus is the instructions of God. We're in Perek Lamed Bet, chapter 32, Pasuk Kav Zayin, verse 27, and he said, "Simu ish harbu hayirecho." Take out those swords, get them ready. Go from gate to gate, area, but Mahanan, the encampment. If necessary, kill your relatives, kill your friends, who's ever guilty. But we know when the dust settled in terms of who died by death of the sword, 3,000, which is terribly tragic, but that is, at least in terms of males, and we don't know if 3,000 was only males, adult males would be 0.5% of the nation. So percentage-wise, a small percentage. Then we know after the plea of Moshe Rabbeinu to forgive, and Hashem said, "Listen, I'm not granting you total forgiveness. You can move forward. I won't really be part of the action anymore." Then it says in Pasuk Lamed He, verse 35, "V'yigov Adonai ta'am." God plagued the nation. So that seemed like another punishment. What does plagued the nation mean? Some say, it doesn't say how many deaths. Some say there was death that occurred maybe at a later time. Some say maybe it was an actual physical death that occurred. And then, of course, we know, what was Moshe Rabbeinu's first reaction when he saw, after he shattered the luchot, the tablets, he then took the egel itself and he burnt it down. And it says, "Vayizir al penei hamayim." He spread it on the water, the so to speak, the gold dust, you can say. Vayashket bnei Yisrael, and he made them drink it, and they'll get another punishment. And in fact, the Gemara Masechet Yomah addresses these three different punishments. And what were those punishments? There's two different opinions in the Gemara. One opinion says, there's Rav and Levi. One opinion says, well, if someone zibeh v'kiter offered korbanot or incense to the egel, beside his punishment was by the sword. If he just showed some endearment and love towards it, then b'mitah. In other words, it wasn't physical punishment, what we call mitah b'dei shamayim. Someone who's just happy about what was going on. Hadrokan, some intestinal disease. And that seemingly is because they drank from the water that had the meltdown, the ashes of the gold of the egel. The other opinion says no. Adim v'hatra'ah, warning and witnesses, that's death by sword. Warning, witnesses without warning, that's death, that's vayiguf. That's the actual non-physical, so to speak, death. And no warning and no witnesses, but just guilt, that was the intestinal disease after drinking the water. So different opinions, but certainly what Moshe Rabbeinu was dealing with as he saw different groupings, different forms of punishment, right? Meaning different levels of guilt. The Rabbi Ibn Sha'ib says there was a fourth grouping. You know the fourth grouping was? The vast majority of Am Yisrael. How do we know that the punishments named are in the minority? Because again, 3,000 deaths, Vayiguf doesn't even mention any deaths. And then how many people were drinking the water? Doesn't seem like the majority of Am Yisrael, right? The Ibn Sha'ib says, you know what the fourth group was? The fourth group was the bystanders who were doing nothing. The bystanders who were really, guilty by observation, guilty by lack of activity, guilty by association. And it was them that Moshe Rabbeinu looked at and said, well, they're of no use. And he saw no one. And for that reason, he asked the question, Mi ladonai elai. Because indeed, Moshe could see nobody of innocence. And therefore, he had to call out, what was the call of Misha LaHashem Elai? What did he want? Who did he expect? What would be how would you frame someone who is, so to speak, LaHashem in this instance? Well, first, let's just talk about what exactly Shevet Levi did. Moshe said, take swords and kill. Unconventional judgment. Where'd that come from? Right? They're the judge and the jury. They're God. Take it out, kill whoever you want, kill relatives, right? And the Ramban discusses this. And he speaks about the fact that there was a necessity to kill publicly, because the only way to diminish a Hilul Hashem, to suppress a desecration of God's name in public, is to actually punish in public. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu's immediate ruling was, and he calls it a Hora'at Sha'ah, because there was too many people to bring to court, right? Really, you should have brought every individual. You should have judged them based on witnesses and circumstances and warning. You couldn't bring thousands of people to court at that moment, right? He was the court. And so his Hora'at Sha'ah, his ruling at the moment was, we need an immediate reversal of Hilul Hashem by punishment in public for those who perpetrated the desecration of God, and thus the murder. And thus Shevet Levi were dispatched, deputized as judges by Moshe Rabbeinu. There are those who say that the charge of go mishar l'shar, he says, the pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu stood in the sha'ar, right? It says he stood in the gate, so to speak. So there are those who say that that is referring to the sha'ar of the Sanhedrin, right? So now he stood in the area of judgment, and that's Sha'ar HaMachaneh, and go from Sha'ar to Sha'ar. The Malbim says that means go then to the minor courts of every single tribe. and therefore there wasn't even some form of judgment that was pronounced in an official way in order to be able to dispatch the Shevet Levi to engage in their murder. Sforno says that this was going to be kapara for all the bystanders, for all those who were so-called innocent. Hey, I didn't bow, I didn't touch, I didn't kiss, I didn't acknowledge the egel. Yeah, but what were you doing when everyone else was doing it? Guilty. And to try to atone for that guilt, you know what their atonement would be? Watch as Shevet Levi meets out the punishment, and you stand by and don't do anything, because you won't merit what Shevet Levi is about to merit. And that'll be your kapara for doing nothing. So here Moshe Rabbeinu is, where he finally says, I have no way of getting a hold of the situation. Who is going to be La Hashem? Shevet Levi steps up, he dispatches them, and he tells them to mete out justice. At that very moment, Shevet Levi changed history by saying yes. And it really behooves us to understand what is the call of me La Hashem. And the truth is, we have similar calls throughout the history of Am Yisrael. How many times did Abraham Avinu accept the call? How many times did Abraham Avinu understand that there was a call from God? Who's to God? There was no one to God, right? Look at the war, for instance. The Palit, the general, comes to Abraham Avinu and he came by Yagela Abraham Ha'ivri. What's going on around here? Mila Hashem Elai, right? This is God's calling. And he jumped in, sprung into action. And he waged war and he freed Lot and all the captives, etc. You can say that about many stories about Abraham Avinu. How about another moment in history when his future daughter-in-law, right? Well, we have Yitzhak, the heir to the throne. Who's his wife? What's the second generation of Judaism look like? And they go and they find, and you have the whole story, they exit at the well. Only problem is that the main party needs to agree. And so they approach Rivka, future Rivka Imenu, a young woman, and ask her, Ha'elech, ha'telech im ha'ish hazeh, will you go with this man? You know what that question really was? Mila Hashem Elai. We need the second generation of Judaism is calling. Are you that person? In one word, she said, Elech, I will go. She changed Jewish history. That was the call of Mila Hashem Elai. You see this repeated just a few weeks ago on Parashat Yitzro, on Har Sinai. The call went out to Am Yisrael. It's up to you. Take it or leave it. Na'aseh v'nishma. We'll take it. How about a few days ago on Purim, Megillat Esther, when the call came to Esther, and Mordechai, after she tried to back out, essentially says, maybe this is why you're queen. Mila Hashem Elai. So I have here the Emek Davar, and the Emek Davar says, you know what the essence of that call really is? He says it's definitely not a call for who's not going to worship Avodah Zarah, because the truth is that most of Am Yisrael weren't worshiping Avodah Zarah. It's clear from the punishments and who suffered the consequences of punishments, it was just the minority. And there were different groupings and different levels of guilt. The vast majority were bystanders. And Moshe Rabbeinu knew that. And yet he still called Mi Hashem Elai. I'll read you his words. He says, what that call was, Mi Yodea Ba'asmo Shu Ach LaHashem. Limsor Nafsho V'chol Asher Lo La'ahavat Hashem. Who really feels that there's nothing motivating him but God? Are you willing to sacrifice and do what is necessary to give yourself over to God and demonstrate your love for him? Is there no ulterior motive? Are you unafraid? Are you unafraid of reputation? Are you unafraid of taking a stand? Are you unafraid of how it looks? Are you unafraid of being different? Most of Am Yisrael were guilty, and maybe with really out any punishment, but the punishment was not being given the opportunity. They were guilty of not stepping up when God needed them to step up. Mi la Hashem Elai is a call that you innately have to hear. in situations and throughout Jewish history, great people, men and women, heard the call. And every one of them, those were pivotal moments, changed Jewish history when they accepted that call. Mila Hashem Elai, as the Emek Davar says, is who is absolutely pure in intent and willing to commit and sacrifice and give themselves over, whatever that entails. Shevet Levi says there's no strings attached over here. What God says, I do, I'm ready for the challenge. I understand, I have perspective of what this moment really means in our history. And because of that, they became the eternal tribe to lead Am Yisrael, to serve in the Bet HaMikdash, to be the teachers for Am Yisrael, to have a higher status, going to the future and forever, because of one moment of understanding of what the call of God was in that horrible, chaotic, and sinful moment that became a pivotal and holy moment for a group of people who understood what the call of God and Moshe Rabbeinu was, Mila Hashem Elai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.